My name is Navroz Dubash. I am a professor at the Center for Policy Research here in Delhi, and I've been working on climate change policy and governance issues for about 2 decades and a little bit more than that, in fact, now. What we do here at CPR is we do research on climate policy, we have discussions with the government, we work with a lot of civil society organizations, and we're also involved through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, trying to address and understand the state of climate policy debates, not just in India, but also globally. So one of the things that we've worked on, for example, is trying to understand India's low carbon future. We've been part of India's committees to try and assess carbon policy. And a particular interest here in our group is to try and understand the linkages between climate change and development. So something that very strongly informs all of our work is the idea that climate change is not something distinct from India's development debates, but has to be linked to them. So today I'm going to talk about international policy and governance around climate change. And I'm going to do this by taking on 3 or 4 different topics. The starting point for any discussion of climate change has to be climate science. How do we know this is a problem? And how does our understanding of the problem then shape climate policy and politics? So I'll talk a little bit about that, though I know that you will have, your students will have access to other lectures on climate science, but I think we have to start with this area. Second, I'll talk a little bit about why climate change is such a hard problem to tackle. What is it that makes it so difficult to address in terms of countries getting together and doing something about the problem? Then I'll talk about climate negotiations. This is a long and complex subject, but I'm just going to give what I've called a potted history, a very brief take on what has happened in the last 20 odd years of climate negotiations. And finally discuss the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 and is the latest iteration of international efforts at resolving climate change. So these are the 4 broad categories that I'll take you through today. So to begin with, how confident are we about climate science? Well, what you can see from these graphs here is that in a number of ways and through a number of metrics, we see an increasing trend in everything from land and ocean surface temperatures at the top, obviously greenhouse gas concentrations, the average sea level, and this is another way of representing the total global anthropogenic or human-made carbon dioxide emissions. So we see all kinds of things changing globally. We see metrics around land, oceans, etc. And there are other graphs that I haven't shown here about ice cover. All of these things are changing. The question is, are they changing because of climate change? How can we know this with some certainty? So this graph helps us understand that. This is a slightly older graph from the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and all of my science graphs are taken from the IPCC. Now, what this graph tells us, for different regions of the world, you see a blue band and you see a pink band. Now, the blue band tells you what our climate models suggest is likely to happen if climate change and the greenhouse effect is not real, right? And the pink band tells us what the models predict if we think the greenhouse effect is real. And the black line tells you what actual recorded temperatures have been over time. And across different regions of the world, you see that actual recorded temperatures better map the pink line or the pink band than they do the blue band. And you can see this here for the global data, where globally the recorded temperature maps the pink band, that is with a greenhouse effect and what the theory tells us is likely to happen because of increasing greenhouse gases, and the same with land and ocean. So what this tells us is 2 things. It tells us that our models are doing a reasonably good job capturing the effects of greenhouse gas forcing on the atmosphere and the oceans, and that our real data, our temperature records, are showing some correspondence that is much more tight with the global, with the greenhouse effect than without it. So both of these things give us confidence that this is a phenomenon that is actually happening and probably explains some of the other things we're measuring in terms of temperatures, rainfall, and so on and so forth. So what is this going to add up to? Where will this lead us? And what this graph tells us is that to some extent, the future is in our hands. With substantial mitigation, we will see some warming on the level of sort of 1 to 1.5 degrees off into the, this is out to the next 100 years or so. And without additional mitigation, we're going to see much higher levels of warming in the range of the darker red 4 to 5 degrees of warming. So there is a choice that we have to make globally, collectively, as to what we're going to do about this. Now, understanding that choice can be put two ways. One way is this. We have a finite amount of carbon dioxide, in particular, greenhouse gases more generally, but carbon dioxide, which is the largest source of largest greenhouse gas. We have a finite amount that we can emit if we want to stay within a 2-degree warming threshold, which is politically what has been agreed to, though recently in the Paris Agreement, there's also talk of 1.5 degrees. So the total carbon budget is on the order of 790 gigatons of carbon. We have already used, until 2011, about 515 of these, which leaves us with 275 gigatons. Now, the science is continually changing, so there's some debate about whether that number is 275, 300, 400, whatever that might be. But the point is, there is a finite amount of carbon that as a human society we can collectively emit. The question becomes, who gets to emit that carbon, right? So that's why I call this a zero-sum allocation story. We have to collectively decide who gets to emit the limited amount of remaining carbon. Politically, the way this science frames the challenge is to say, we as nations have to squabble over who has emitted how much and who gets to emit the rest. That's how it's set up, right? So if somebody gets to emit more, somebody else naturally emits less. So the science shapes the politics in this way. But there's another way to tell the story, which is the idea that reducing greenhouse gases need not always have costs. And this is a story that's slightly more hopeful. It says that sometimes good development outcomes can happen at the same time as you have good climate outcomes. And one example that's often talked about is air pollution. So this graph basically just tells us that in many parts of the world, you could actually decrease greenhouse gases, and the actions you would take to decrease greenhouse gases will also lead to decreased air pollution. So there are gains. Rather than it being a cost to your economy, there are net gains, at least when it comes to human health, from decreasing greenhouse gases. And there are maybe many other such instances of these so-called co-benefits, which is a theme I'll come back to. Another way of telling the same story, this is a graph for India. Many of your students will be familiar with this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a set of goals that the United Nations system has put out as objectives for the coming decade or two, and they range from everything from no poverty, hunger, education, gender equality, industrial innovation, life on land, life below water, and so on. What this graph interestingly tells us is that according to some analysis, the things that you would do to reduce the effects of climate change and to mitigate climate change will also lead to gains for many of these SDGs. So for example, here you can see big gains in terms of affordable and clean energy, which is perhaps expected, but also you see some gains in terms of clean water and sanitation. You will also see big advantages in the areas of cities. So in other words, good development choices can come along with climate change, right? So these are two very different ways of looking at the problem. So just to sum this up, when it comes to climate science, I think what we have to take forward is that this is extremely complex and it's constantly changing. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is tasked with making sense of this on a regular basis. So I, at least, and I would suggest that as teachers, sending students actually to the IPCC websites to read some of those original documents will help them understand both what kind of summary lessons they can take away, as well as understand the robustness of the process through which those conclusions are arrived at. Because the IPCC is backed by peer review processes. And it's an open and transparent process, and there are some interesting discussions in the literature. For example, this series of articles by Victor et al. In the journal Science about Whether or not the IPCC is politicized, to what extent it can be thought of as politicized, how much we could trust it, there's an interesting literature around the science of climate change and its implications for policy that I think would make interesting reading for students. The second thing I think we can take, which I haven't got into in great detail here, I think there are other resources available for this, is that there are now sufficient evidence of climate impacts and that India in particular is highly vulnerable. This is an important point for us in engaging with Indian policy debates. But the third point that I want to leave you with in this section is the last thing that I said, which is that the science allows us to either talk about climate change as a zero-sum issue where there is a finite carbon budget, or it also allows us to talk about it as a potentially positive-sum issue, which means that two parties both engaging can both gain. In that sense, it's positive-sum through this idea of co-benefits. Now, I don't think we conclusively know whether in every case it is positive-sum or not, but there may be some cases such as air pollution where in fact it is positive-sum. And it shapes the politics of dealing with climate change in a very different way when we think about it in this way. So with that, let's go on to understanding why tackling climate change is so hard. Now, there's a substantial literature around this. So climate change has been called, for example, a wicked problem because the scale of the changes is so enormous and the kinds of things that have to happen to address those changes is also simultaneously very, very large. So I've just pulled out a few reasons why I think it is so difficult. One is simply the scale of the problem. Carbon dioxide in particular pervades all industrial processes, pretty much all industrial processes. In fact, the history of industrial development could be understood as the co-evolution of industrial society and fossil fuels. The Industrial Revolution started with the use of fossil fuels, with coal and then oil and then gas, and then moving on now to nuclear and renewable energy. And so we don't know industrial society in a way that is different from its use of fossil fuels. So addressing climate change literally means changing the way we do development, changing the way we understand industrial society, and managing an energy transition beyond fossil fuels in a scant 30 to 40 years. That is a fraction of the time it took us to actually go through the Industrial Revolution processes from around 1850 to today. So in a fraction of that period, we have to completely remake the way in which our societies engage with and use energy productively. So that's an enormous transition. It's a technological transition. It's also a behavioral transition, and it's also an institutional transition. And those last two are often forgotten, but they're very important. So for example, if we want to not have a private car-led transport system in cities, we have to make sure that our citizens are willing to use public transport, which is more energy efficient, for example. The second reason it's such a challenge is that it is a global collective action problem. So climate change basically requires almost every country to act. Now let's take India, for example. India is about 5 to 6% of global emissions. So one often hears in policy circles, we are only 6% of global emissions. If we go away tomorrow, if we go to zero tomorrow, the problem still remains. That's true. At the same time, we are now the world's third largest emitter. So if India says that we don't have to act, what about the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and there on out, all those countries, right? For this problem to be solved, every country will have to pull together. The two largest emitters, China and the US, on an annual basis, are substantially larger, closer to 15 to 20%. In fact, even higher than that for China. And so this argument does not work so well for them. But I think broadly, if we are to solve this problem, everybody, all countries will have to take some measures. Now, that doesn't mean they have to take equivalent measures, but they have to take some measures. Now, how do you decide which country takes what measures? Now, in a world of jostling among nations, in a world that is more often driven by realism than by idealism, every country is going to try and get away with as little as it can do, especially if it thinks that climate change is a zero-sum problem. That is a problem that will cost its economy something. So it's a question of a power struggle. in the past, the US was the dominant world power, say through the 1990s at least, following the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the last decade or 2 decades, you've now had the rise of the basic countries, that is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And these countries have said, look, we feel we're starting from a lower base, we have a lot more use for this energy, we need to also emit. And they're a powerful enough bloc, India included, where I think the US cannot dictate terms. And so the politics of solving this global collective action problem are even more complicated in this multipolar world that we find ourselves in the late 2010s. Third reason this is complicated is that many issues can be neatly divided into either a foreign policy issue or a domestic policy issue. Climate change can't. The global collective action story is a foreign policy issue, but the way in which we implement it very much depends on the extent to which we can shape and remake our domestic economies. And so in areas like trade policy, technology policy, or in sectors like energy, environment, and industry, there has to be a lot of sophisticated back and forth between different bits of the government in order to come up with something sensible. And I'll talk about this later in the context of climate institutions. But I think it's important that your students get a good sense of why this is such a challenging problem and why the nature of this problem is different from many other policy problems. And I think these are at least 3 reasons why that's the case. So just to quickly put India in global context a little bit and show why India has taken the positions that we have in global climate negotiations. So if you look here, this blue line tells us what share India's emissions are of the total, which is the line up here, right? So India is, as I said earlier, about 6% of the total global emissions. It is rising as a share because as India has grown, notably global emissions are rising faster, and that is really basically a story about China. Starting around here when China started growing very fast, global emissions picked up. So as a share of total emissions, we are 6%, and we have gone from being the 6th largest emitter to the 3rd largest emitter in the last few years. But in per capita or per person terms, we are still quite small. That's what these purple bars show. So we are at around little over 2 tons per person. Every Indian emits about 2 tons, while the global average is about 6 tons. So we are a third of the global average. And some of the richer industrialized countries emit much, much more, on the order of 12 tons, 15 tons, and so on. Notably, China is right around the global average, which is about 6 tons at this time. So a lot of India's policy has been shaped by this. Yes, we are a large emitter, but the reason we're a large emitter is because we have a lot of people. And each individual person doesn't emit very much. I recommend reading a piece by Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. I think your students would find it very interesting. He was one of India's earliest negotiators, and he has a first-hand account of the early days of the negotiation, where he struggled to make this point, where developed country negotiators would say, well, look, India is a large country, your emissions are going to grow. And he used to tell a story where he said, look, if we had a global food crisis, you wouldn't ask everybody to reduce their food consumption in equal proportion. Those who are consuming much less food would be asked to do less, and the same is true for greenhouse gases. And this is an argument that India has had for a very, very long time, and that has shaped our policy. One reason India gets so much pressure, as I've alluded to earlier, is what I'm calling the shadow of China. Just another tip for your students, there are now lots of publicly available databases. One of them that I've used here is the Climate Analysis Indicator tool, which allows you to look at emissions data and organize it and slice it in different ways, and you can ask your own questions, and it's quite a useful metric. So I've used that here to just pull out the emissions trajectory of China, the US, the EU, 28 countries of the European Union, and India over the last couple of decades. And you can see the astonishing rise of China. Right around the time when China acceded to the World Trade Organization in 2001, it went from being half of US emissions to being almost double of US emissions over a period of what? 15 years, right? So it's really an extraordinary rise. One reason India gets so much pressure is they see this increase here and they wonder what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. Is India also going to do this? Because if India follows the same trajectory as China, whatever our arguments about per person and so on and so forth, that global carbon budget would get eaten up extremely fast. So that is why India has been under a fair bit of pressure. But from an Indian point of view, we are starting at such a low base, much lower. So in fact, our base is lower than China's in 1990, our current base. And we are actually a much more energy efficient economy than China. But this is the tension that India faces. We are almost uniquely placed in the global climate context. There is no other country that is so large, starting at such a low base, also growing quite fast, but that is also reasonably efficient. So as we enter this conversation, I want to come back to the way in which, and I'll get into the negotiations in just a second. I want to get back to where we ended the science section, right? Over the first 20 years or so of climate negotiations starting in 1990, the assumption has been that climate change is a global collective action problem, that there is a finite pie and the only issue is how we divide up that pie. That has been the way in which conventional wisdom has thought about this. And in India, some of the more interesting articles about this are by Jayaraman and Kanitkar, among others. The group of basic countries I alluded to earlier came out with their own analysis of the carbon budget, which is worth referring to. But the idea that because we have to divide up the carbon pie, we need to have some basis in equity, some equitable basis of dividing up that pie. It can't be random. It can't be on the basis of who has emitted most already. There has to be some normative and principled equity basis. That has been the dominant strand of the conversation for many, many years. More recently, the work of Elinor Ostrom has raised this idea of polycentric governance, which is more consistent with what I talked about in the science section when I alluded to co-benefits. And polycentric governance basically says that the climate problem is the net effect of lots of disparate actions by individuals, states, cities, businesses, communities, and countries. And they make those choices for a range of reasons. Most of them are actually not for climate reasons. So we need to understand the reasons they make those choices and understand the aggregate effect of all those choices, and then try and shape them not top-down through a climate process, but through a bottom-up process that takes into account the actual a bottom-up process that takes into account the actual drivers shaping those actions. So climate mitigation is then driven by other consideration, that there are multiple pathways to different outcomes, and co-benefits are very important. Right? So these are two different ways of looking at the climate problem, and I want to really sort of come back to that because I think it drives it has driven the shift in the negotiations process that we've seen in the last few years. Now let me take you through the negotiations process. So the starting point for this is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And I strongly recommend that if you're teaching this material, your students actually go back and look at some of this original source document. Pull out the Framework Convention, have them read through it, try and identify some of the key phrases. So one of the key phrases is this idea of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. And there are whole PhD theses written on this word but, because originally the language said common and differentiated, and one of our negotiators actually managed to change it to common but differentiated, and legally that has had a lot of resonance and implications in the climate world going forward. And I think this article by Ambassador Dasgupta that I alluded to from 2012 tells that story very, very nicely. What the Framework Convention did is it said everybody has a common responsibility, so India included, but that responsibility is differentiated based on how much you have contributed to the problem and how much you are capable of solving the problem. So common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, right? So much of the follow-on academic work has been an effort to put some texture to these words responsibility and capability. So because the Framework Convention agreed that industrialized countries or developed countries have a greater responsibility and a greater capability, the Kyoto Protocol in the mid-1990s created a separate annex of developed countries and said they have to act first. Now, at the time, this was a consensus view, but then the politics in the US changed, and in the US basically decided not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and has not been, in fact, part of the Kyoto process ever since. And the arguments the US gave were competitiveness concerns. In other words, if our industries have to comply with the Kyoto Protocol, but India and China, and they named these two countries in a Senate resolution, do not have to comply, then our businesses will suffer as a result. So what followed was a decade and a half long process which tried to get around the fact that while developed countries do have the first responsibility, at the same time, for competitiveness reasons, it was not politically possible to say that developing countries would also not do something. So how could you square that circle? And there's been a lot of conversation in the intervening years on how to do this. And the next key moments were in Copenhagen in 2009 and in Paris in 2015. And the key issue, and I'm simplifying what is a very complex story, but the key issue was how to interpret common responsibility versus differentiated responsibility. Are all countries meant to move, or do some countries have to move faster, and how do you decide? Related to this was the idea that while the assumption, if you have a global collective action story and you have a finite carbon budget, you should have some global top-down decision on who does what. So you have a top-down allocation structure versus a more polycentric bottom-up structure where every country says, look, here's what we think we can do, right? And should these be hard legal pledges, hard legal commitments rather, or should these be relatively soft pledges that countries are not bound to? So these are the key issues. And as I mentioned earlier, these issues became particularly hard to deal with because of shifts in geopolitical context. So, I always find it interesting to give students some sense of visually what is going on. So this is a shot from COP15 or the Conference of Parties to the Climate Convention, number 15, the 15th time they have met in Copenhagen. So now you have these very complicated issues, and you have all these countries sitting around with these nameplates, and you have the bureau and the chair and so on sitting at the head table, and they have this text, and they're going back and forth over this text, negotiating individual words like but and, putting them in square brackets. So this is a very cumbersome, legally dense way of sorting out what are conceptually complicated issues. Because remember, it's not like they have an agreement on the idea and then they put it into legal language. They're trying to figure out the agreement on the idea at the same time as they're drafting the language. So it's very, very complicated. At the same time, you have a parallel process going on outside. This is again from Copenhagen, right? So there's this nice sign, there is no planet B, because people at that time were talking about, well, if Copenhagen fails, what's plan B? And the protesters were saying, we can't afford a plan B, there's no planet B. And these were thousands, tens of thousands of people, and a lot of sort of upwelling of civil society organizations and others who had arrived there to kind of protest this issue. So a very charged environment. Now, what I want to do is boil down this 20 years of negotiation for you into one somewhat complicated diagram, but I think it's worth spending a little time on the diagram. So I call this the climate trilemma, and a trilemma is something where you have to choose between three things and only two objectives can be satisfied. You have three objectives and only two of them can be satisfied at one time. So what are our three objectives? The first is the primary one of solving the climate problems. There's an environmental objective which has been articulated as avoiding a more than 2-degree world. From a developing country point of view, equity, making sure that whatever solution countries adopt is not unfair, does not restrict the development choices of the world's poor. Right? If you're at 2 tons per capita and another country is at 12 tons per capita, you shouldn't be restricted to 2 tons for the indefinite future. But the third is also this idea of competitiveness, which really motivated in particular the US, but more generally the industrialized world, that we don't want our industries to take on an unfair burden. So these are the 3 objectives. Now, if you decided that you wanted to solve environment and equity, we have an answer. The answer is you look at the carbon budget, so 200 and something odd gigatons, and you allocate that budget based on some principle around a sharing of a burden. You might say that countries that have not emitted much in the past should get more in the future. You might say that poorer countries get more, etc., etc. So you come up with some agreement and you allocate it. The problem with that approach is most of the fairness approaches essentially require the rich countries, United States, Western Europe, Australia, to go to almost zero emissions tomorrow, failing which they have to pay to use those emissions. Politically, that's simply not feasible because most countries will not say we are going to impose on our populations the requirement of going to zero emissions tomorrow or be faced with the choice of paying for those emissions. So that's a very difficult axis to side of the triangle to satisfy. The second option is really a Kyoto plus option, which was what was talked about in Copenhagen. It says, all right, we're going to try environment and competitiveness. What that does is industrialized countries, the rich countries, and this is what they put on the table in Copenhagen, they said, we are willing to go to 80% reduction below our current levels by the year 2050. Right? That's what we are willing to do. We are willing to stand behind that. The problem is that if they, and that sounds like a big number, 80%. The problem is that if they did that, developing countries would have to do whatever was left in order to keep us below 2 degrees. And when you do the mathematics, what is left is actually a lot. So developing countries end up being kept to a much lower per capita emissions level in perpetuity, essentially. Right? So developed countries say, this is what our societies can stand politically, now you go off and do the rest. And developing countries said, well, no, because that is still a considerable burden for us. So that didn't work. You're left only with a third axis. The third axis is to say, developing countries will think about equity, developed countries will think about economic competitiveness, and in essence, every country will put on the table what it thinks its own political system will bear. And then we'll see how we're doing, right? Notably, what happens? The environmental goal vanishes, right? Nobody's thinking about the environmental goal. Essentially, what happened in Paris is, after having tried A and trying B, we ended up with C. That was the only route that was left. This is the Paris resolution, right? What Paris said is, every country puts a bottom-up voluntary pledge on the table, and then the way in which it tried to square the circle with the environmental goal is they said, we will do a regular stock take to see what the pledges add up to and see whether we can try and close the gap. Right? That is the architecture of Paris, and it comes directly out of this politics and history. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the Paris Agreement. Now, there's been an awful lot written about Paris in India and elsewhere. There are a few review papers. There's a very good book on climate law by my colleague Lavanya Rajamani that I think is an excellent resource for students that I strongly recommend you take a look at, that you ask your students to take a look at. There are some review papers in a journal called the Wiley Interdisciplinary Reviews on Environment and Sustainability. WIRES is the short form. I have a review paper there on India, but there are many other review papers, and it's a very good source for students to quickly understand what is going on around an issue. So now, to talk about Paris in a little bit more detail. What the Paris Agreement said, and this was signed in 2015, is they tried to come up with a deal that was both bottom up and top down, as I've explained, right? So going back to this graph, this is sort of the bottom up part, which is the pledges, and the top down is the linking to the environment. So every country puts on the table NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, for both mitigation, that is reduction in greenhouse gases, and adaptation, that is adapting to the effect of increasing warming. The pledges were not to be set by international negotiations, but to be set by each country deciding what its own society could bear. Interestingly, and there's been debate about this, were these legally binding or not? Paris was legally binding, in the sense that it has bound every country to put on the table a pledge, but it doesn't bind a country to put on the table a particular pledge, right? So it binds in terms of its procedures, it doesn't bind in terms of outcomes. And in this way, it was actually kind of an innovation in international law. Most people who are international lawyers argue that a binding outcome of substance is what really makes a change. The Paris gamble was to say, if you can get countries down the path of thinking about this, putting on the table some processes, maybe they'll find that co-benefits, polycentric processes, all these things mean that it's not as much of a trade-off between climate and development as they earlier thought. And that was the idea. The top-down part of the Paris Agreement is the so-called ratchet mechanism, which says every 5 years we will do a global aggregate stocktake of country pledges. We won't assess each country's pledge, we will add them up and see how we're doing. Right? And that adding up process will then create pressure to increase pledges and make them better and more rigorous after 5 years. A key part of this then is this transparency mechanism and technical expert review. Now, some of us who've been involved in these discussions have been somewhat critical of the Indian government for not being more in support of the transparency mechanism, because India, as a voluntary country, should actually be demanding that every country tell us more about what it's doing, and we've been a little bit concerned that the transparency mechanism will be used to pressure India to do more. But I think there's an interesting political dynamic here, whether it's in India's interest to stave off pressure, or whether it's in India's interest to say, it's fine if we do more as long as other countries do even more than us in order to limit climate change itself. Finally, something that India has been pushing for, which is finance and technology support. In essence, this was a non-starter at Paris. There were very weak provisions with regard to finance and technology support, which historically in the climate negotiations, the industrialized countries are supposed to provide developing countries. But in this kind of bottom-up pledge-based world, this was really not something that politically India or the other developing countries could make much headway on. Okay, so will Paris work? There are some hard questions here. Will the Paris pledges add up to what is required by science? Will Paris be fair in the sense that if they don't add up to what is required by science, who will have to do more? Who will the pressure come onto? And how do we know how we compare different countries? So there is a report called the Emissions Gap Report produced every year by the UN Environment Programme, and I again recommend this is a good document to keep track of climate debates. It's a good one for students to access. It's really available. And what they do using modeling data is they project future emissions. This is out to about 2030. And they say this is what would have happened in a pre-Paris world, right? This is what current policies take us to, and these are the NDCs. Now, the reason there are two lines here is that countries have put on the table so-called unconditional pledges as well as conditional pledges, conditional on receiving finance and technology, and those are a little bit more stringent. So developing countries have said, if we get money, if we get technology, we can do more. And this is what the models say is required by science, and there's always a range here, if we are to stay below 2 degrees. And as you can see, this is now a few years old, but the gap has not changed much. The gap is on the order of between 12 and 14 gigatons, 12 and 14 billion tons. Current emissions are on the order of 50 to 60 around 50 gigatons. So this is a considerable gap. It's on the order of a 20% gap, right? 20-25%. We're 20-25%, nearly a third short of where we should be. So now there's a further discussion about this. So some people look at this and they say, well, clearly this is not going to work. This is an undershoot. The pledges won't get us to where we have to get. Other people have a different view. They say, if you think that the pledges are a mechanical target and countries put out the most ambitious pledge that they can, then it's probably true we won't get there. But if you think that countries are being cautious and putting out cautious pledges, and these pledges are better thought of as a floor to what they achieve rather than as a ceiling on what they'll achieve, then many countries may over-comply with their pledges. And if you buy the polycentric governance argument, that just through a learning by doing process, they'll figure out that they can do more and it will cost less than they earlier thought. So that's the glass half full version. And the glass half empty version is the pledges simply don't add up. And I don't think we'll know the answer to this until we actually do that adding up process around 2022, which is the first time this is scheduled to be added up. Another direction of literature that I want to bring people's awareness to, and there's a lot of literature here on the internet. There's a group called the Climate Action Tracker. There's lots of web-based tracking of what countries are doing. And what the Climate Action Tracker has tried to do, this is a graph for India, they have said, how do we know if a country's NDC is fair or not fair? Now, over the 20-year history of these negotiations, different groups have put out different definitions of fairness. So what they say is, we're not going to pick among them. We're going to look at a whole range of definitions of fairness. So these different bars are all different metrics of what is considered fairness. And we will map a country's emissions and see where it lands in terms of these different metrics of fairness. So there's a whole literature now on metrics of fairness. I will also make just one more point here, which is that all these international efforts have led to one big change. It's hard to know how they'll add up, but most countries in the world now have some form of climate legislation or climate strategy and a greenhouse gas target of some form. In fact, on the order of 90% of countries now have a greenhouse gas target in place, right? We can quibble about whether it's enough, but we're a long way from 10 or 15 years ago when we were discussing whether some countries should and shouldn't have these targets. All countries have said, look, we're moving in the direction of thinking about what our economic development means for climate change. Now the question is, will they learn that it's harder to deal with than they thought, or will they learn that it's easier to deal with than they thought? And I think we're poised right on the edge of that question right now in terms of international climate policy. How are we going to fill this gap? Yet another area of thinking has been, all right, look, states can only do so much to fill this gap. But maybe communities, businesses, cities, all of these different collectives can take on different aspects of the climate problem and make their own pledges. So there's a lot of studies now that say, so here we have the same gap that we talked about earlier, right? And we have estimates from different studies. These are all estimates that have been measured. These are all projected estimates of whether or not that gap can be filled. There's a lot of doubt about these estimates. A lot of these numbers are not very robust as yet. And it's also not clear whether these actions are on top of what countries are doing or they are part of what countries are doing. So how we add these up is not very clear. But there is a huge momentum behind understanding what role non-state actors can play. One other reason why there's so much momentum is, of course, the politics of the United States. As you will know, and as your students will know, President Trump has announced his intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The US is rolling back its climate policies. It is the world's largest historical emitter and second largest emitter on an annual basis. But there are other forces within the United States that are saying, okay, if the government won't lead, we will lead, communities, cities, and so on and so forth. And so Because this has taken on so much resonance in the US, it has also become part of the global conversation. So the role of non-state actors in climate governance is an emergent area of work that I want to draw your attention to. So finally, just a few things to keep in mind. I think it's important for your students to start in a foundational way with the idea of climate science, examine its credibility, satisfy themselves with regard to its credibility, because there have been lots of efforts to call into question climate science, but also within a nuanced way understand the implied political framings of different ways of articulating climate science. And I don't mean this in a negative way. I don't mean this in a way that says that science is being politicized. Knowledge always has different political ramifications based on how it's presented. So presenting a carbon budget and presenting polycentric governance are both correct, but they have different political implications. Second, I think, is to understand why this is a different challenge to, say, arms control or negotiating a trade agreement or negotiating a human rights agreement. And has to do with sort of the interwovenness of climate and fossil fuels, at least in part. For students who are interested, understanding the twists and turns of climate law and the international negotiation process, I think, are important. I think it's very useful to understand the ways in which the Paris Agreement marks a sharp departure from the past. We have moved to a more bottom-up, pledge-based system with the hope that countries will learn through a learning by doing mechanism, and by seeing other countries taking on more stringent action, they will diminish their own, they will reduce their own objections to taking action at home. And finally, keep an eye on Paris. We don't know if the numbers will add up, but we will in a few years. And I think the key to that is going to be the extent to which we have transparent mechanisms so we can add up those numbers credibly, and whether new drivers such as non-state actors will help us bridge that gap. So in conclusion, this is a long and rich area, climate law and governance. I think it's actually at one of its most interesting moments right now. It's at a turning point where this innovative mechanism, according to some, that is the Paris Agreement, and according to others, this weak mechanism, we have to see how it plays out. And I think how it will play out will actually be less at the international arena and more in terms of what it stimulates by way of domestic actions. So I think the next area to look at is domestic climate policy and governance and what shapes those domestic actions. Thank you.